everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read in January, so little mini reviews of the 16 books that I got to in the first month of the year. Firstly, I want to apologise if you can hear the wind outside. There's nothing I can do about that. But because I have a lot of books to talk about, I am just going to get straight into it. I'm going to talk about the fiction for younger readers first, then the fiction for grown-ups, then non-fiction, and then the one poetry book that I read in January. Is this the way that people like to view wrap-ups? Because I know there are lots of different ways of doing them. Some people just do it in the order that they read the books. Some people go from their lowest star rating to their highest star rating. Leave me a comment down below and let me know if you have any preference about that kind of thing. And also, all of the books that I am mentioning will be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more. This first book I technically finished in February, but I only had like 50 pages that I had to read this morning. So I'm going to include it here, and that is Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler with art by Maria Kalman. You may know Daniel Handler better by his pseudonym Lemony Snicket, but this is very different from a series of unfortunate events. This is a YA book that follows the relationship between two teenage characters. We follow Ed and Minerva, or Min for short, and we view their relationship through a series of letters that Min sends Ed, along with objects that relate to their relationship in some way. And through those letters and those objects, she explains to him why they broke up. I thought that was a really interesting narrative device to use. I didn't love this book until it got to literally the last couple chapters. Throughout the book, there have been indicators as to why they weren't working in a relationship and why they broke up, but when it reaches the final straw of why they broke up, that was something that really hit home with me. Both of these characters are quite dramatic, but that actually really rang true to me for a really intense first love teenage relationship. I saw a lot of people I've dated in the past in Ed, like a lot of the negative attributes, and there were things that just really rang true to me. And even though I feel like Min knows that this relationship is never going to work, it's just so intense and she loves him so much. I don't think this book was amazing. I don't think there was anything particularly profound or nuanced about it, but I do really believe the characters in this book. I think if you're intrigued by it, definitely give it a go, and the illustrations that are in this really help to tell the story as well. I thought that was a really nice element to the novel. I have Love is for Losers by Wibke Brugman. This is one that I nabbed from work, and genuinely I think it's one of the best YA books that I have ever read. In this book we follow Phoebe, who is a 15-year-old girl whose mother is a war doctor. So whenever her mother goes off to work, she is sent to live with a family friend, and I found that dynamic between those two characters really interesting. The fact that this woman isn't Phoebe's mother, but she is such, she's definitely her primary caregiver. In many ways, Phoebe is a typical grumpy teenager. She feels quite antisocial, and that's kind of part of her identity. Phoebe also doesn't get relationships, and when her best friend is in a relationship, she finds herself feeling quite abandoned in a way that she's never really felt before. Phoebe has a mind that is very much focused on facts and logic, and that's why she doesn't get love. It doesn't make sense to her. She thinks love is for losers until she meets Emma. Phoebe and Emma work together in a charity shop, and Phoebe finds herself becoming slightly obsessed. Not in a creepy way, she just checks Emma's Instagram really regularly. And gradually, over the course of this book, she comes to realise that she's in love with Emma. And what I loved about Phoebe and Emma's sexuality is that it's never made a big deal out of. There is no massive dramatic coming out. They just are who they are. Kate, who is the family friend that Phoebe stays with, is so sex positive, and she's really open with Phoebe. There's never any level of judgment. This is not a sad queer book. This is a book where lovely things happen to the gays. I think if you like the TV show Sex Education, if you like Angus Thongs and Perfect Snogging, then this is a really great book for you. I would really recommend it. It's also told in a really sort of sparse way. All of the dialogue is kind of laid out like a play script, which makes it a really quick and compulsive read as well. This one comes out on the 28th of May, so you do have a little while before you can get hands on a copy, but I would definitely keep your eyes peeled for it when it does come out. Moving from some brand new YA to one of the greats, this is Dini by Judy Blume. I've been gradually working my way through all of Judy Blume's books because I didn't read them when I was a teenager. This book is about a young girl named Dini whose mother is very focused on making sure Dini becomes a model, even if that's not what Dini wants. What happens next for Dini is something that she and no one in her family expected. Her PE teacher notices something is not quite right with Dini's posture. Dini goes to her doctor for some tests about this, and she discovers that there is a problem with her spine. She has scoliosis, I think that's how you say it, which basically means that like her spine isn't growing properly. So she is going to be put in a brace for 4 years that basically like holds her neck and her spine so it's all like completely straight and in the correct position. And the book basically follows Dini's experience of coming to terms with that and her family's experiences of coming to terms with it. We see her mother's very unhelpful reaction to it, acting like it's the end of the world and the end of her hopes, in contrast with her father being extremely supportive and I think exactly what Dini needs. While Dini is just coming to terms with her body changing, she has this other external difference from her peers, and I thought that was really well done. Also, what I loved about this book was it's also so sex positive. This book looks at young girls masturbating and how that's completely normal. Dini speaks about how she masturbates before she goes to sleep and it really helps her nod off, and she doesn't really understand what she's doing, she just knows that it feels good, and that is like explained in the book, and I thought that was fantastic. I think there are some elements of Judy Blume's books that are slightly dated, and also the way that Dini receives treatment for her scoliosis isn't the same way it would be done now, like the medical care has progressed. But I still think if you like these kind of young adult books, Judy Blume's books are always really short, but they pack so much in, and I would really recommend her as a writer. Moving on to the grown-up fiction and something a bit more literary, this is Supper Club by Lara Williams. This book predominantly focuses on 29-year-old Roberta, who decides to start something called the Supper Club, which is basically her and her friends hosting this super lavish banquet dinner party kind of thing where they just gorge themselves on food. It's a book about these women literally taking up space with their growing bodies, but it's also about how they metaphorically desire more space for their desires and their aspirations. It's a book about what happens to women when they just do whatever the fuck they want and they don't care about anyone else. I thought it was really, really great. I really enjoyed it, and I thought the passages that describe food in this were amazingly written. Like, I'm not someone who's like into food writing so much. I have quite a complicated relationship with food. Like, more often than not, I just see food as a fuel. Don't get me wrong, there are meals and foods that I love, and when I'm in the right like headspace and state of mind for it, I definitely recognize how particular meals can really have such a positive impact on you. But more often than not, I have quite a difficult relationship with food where I don't like really appreciate it. But that was something that I really loved about this book, was that the passages that describe food really resonated with me, and I thought they were gorgeous and they made me hungry. So yeah, if you'd like books about women's experiences and desires, then I would definitely recommend this one. Another book about women's experiences, but in a slightly different way, was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I listened to this one on audiobook, and you may know this book as the winner of the most recent Booker Prize. This is a book that follows 4 sets of 3 women. So we have a mother and a daughter and someone else who is related to their lives in some way, and I really enjoyed that as a narrative structure. It's a book that depicts a really wide breadth of women's experiences, and it's a book that ranges over 100 years. There are women in this book that were born in the late 1800s, and there are women who are like 19, and it's all about their experiences of being women, but specifically of being Black women. For some of them, race is an important aspect of their identity. For others, it's something that they don't really think about. There is so much fluidity in these women's identities in terms of their race and how they feel about their race, but also in terms of their gender and their sexuality. When I've heard Bernardine Evaristo talk about this book, she was saying like there are 12 women in this book. Not all of them are going to be heterosexual and cisgender. This book also looks a lot at these women's different understandings of feminism and whether that's important to them or not. I feel like I waited a little while to read this book. I kind of waited for the hype to die down a little bit. And if you are someone who hasn't read it yet for the same reason, then I would highly recommend you get to it now because it won't disappoint. I think it's fantastic and it's actually a really speedy read as well. Next, I have The Wisdom of Sally Red Shoes by Ruth Hogan. Unfortunately, this is one that I didn't enjoy and I am going to be unhauling it. This is a book that is essentially a mediation on grief and loss. There is a lot in here about dealing with cancer, which is something that the author has her own experience of, and I do think, you know, those parts of the book were really like touching and well done. The book really looks at how grief can permeate every aspect of your life and how more often than not it's something that you never fully recover from. I think I just really don't get on with Ruth Hogan's books. I read The Keeper of Lost Things and I also didn't enjoy it. I feel like her cover designer deserves a massive raise because I do wonder how many people like me were drawn into Ruth Hogan's books based on the amazing covers and left very disappointed by their books. I found both of her books like very flat. They both have like quirky, eccentric characters that I just don't believe as people. They also both have like this slightly mysterious elements to them, like something that you're not exactly supposed to know and it's meant to lead to a reveal towards the end of the book, but that doesn't really work when you figured out what that twist was 70 pages in. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about this, and I'm not going to be reading any more of Ruth Hogan's books. That's not to say they're bad. I mean, they receive so much praise and I think there's definitely a market for them, but that's not me. I also read The Hidden Girls by Rebecca Whitney. This is also one that I grabbed from work, but I put it back in the office now. This is a really interesting premise for a book in that it follows new mother Ruth, who is the ultimate unreliable narrator. She has been living with postpartum psychosis, so she's heard things like voices in the walls. She has phoned the police about a number of incidents which have proven to be nothing but her imaginings. Then one day she hears a scream from a petrol station and she doesn't know whether it's something that her mind has fabricated or it's something that she actually heard. The police don't want to spend any more time listening to her because she has wasted so much of their time. But what if she actually did hear a scream? What if there are girls in danger in this petrol station? It's about how the people around her don't believe her, how she doesn't even necessarily believe herself. And it does have that kind of thriller element to it, but ultimately this is also a book about being a new mother, about the pressures that come with that, how she often feels like she's failing, and the strain it puts on her relationship with her husband. I think this book is very timely and important with some of the topics that it deals with, some very serious topics. Definitely a book that I didn't expect to enjoy as much as I did. It's one that I really flew through and I would recommend it if those kind of subject matters are your kind of thing. Next up is actually the first book that I read in January, and that is The Book Ninja by Ali Berg and Michelle Callis. I don't even know where to begin with this book. This book is ridiculous. So this follows our main character named Frankie, who works in a bookshop and she is obsessed with books, and we know this because it's mentioned like every other page. It's just like consistently dropping the names of books and literary references. Like, as someone who is obsessed with books, I don't drop literary references in like every conversation I have. It is absurd, but Frankie is looking for love and she decides the way that she's going to do this is she is going to put her favourite books in like public locations, quite often on like public transport, and leave a note for the man that picks them up to get in touch with her, and she will go on a date with these men and she chronicles it for her blog. At the same time, while she's doing this as like a way of generating content, she also meets a man who reads so much YA fiction, and a huge plot of this book is her turning from like a literary snob to someone who actually appreciates YA fiction. About 35 pages into this book, there is a blog post from the main character where she talks about how it's okay to DNF books, to decide you don't want to finish them, and it's like the authors know and they are giving you permission to just give up on this book. But I kind of like, I just read this book in fascination. There's one section where she's talking about like finding the perfect man, and she says, and he's read every single Oscar Wilde novel, as if that's like something to brag about. Oscar Wilde literally wrote one novel. I loved the premise for this book. I thought it was so cute, and this is a cute book. Like, I did find myself getting invested in these characters, but the writing leaves a lot to be desired. But you know, not every book needs to be phenomenally written. Sometimes it can just be a fun read. But I don't think I'm going to keep this one in my life, and I'm going to go put it in my local book swap, and I apologise to the person who picks this up because I did annotate this book a lot from some of the ridiculous stuff that's in it. Another romance book that I read in January that I think was executed a lot better was Our Stop by Laura Jane Williams. This book follows the romance between Daniel and Nadia, which is kick-started when Daniel spots Nadia on the Northern Line, the tube line in London. I did enjoy that aspect of the book because I get the Northern Line every day, and it allowed me to put myself in the shoes of someone who meets the love of their life on a tube, which I think is something that like everyone has daydreamed about when they've seen someone like cute on public transport. I think that's a really great way of connecting with these characters. Daniel spots Nadia and he decides to put an advert in a paper that she reads every day, basically saying like, hi, super cute girl with a coffee stained shirt who gets on this train at this time, I'm the guy that stands by the doors. And they have like a little bit of correspondence through that, and they're both getting like really excited about it, but basically a lot of stuff gets in the way of them actually meeting. They have so many like near-missed encounters with each other. Eventually, when they do arrange to go on a date, Daniel has to leave early because he gets a phone call from his mother, who is very distraught. Daniel's father has recently died, and they're both grappling with the grief from that. I thought that was a really interesting aspect of this novel, was like Daniel dealing with that, but particularly him dealing with that as a man, and how toxic masculinity can often get in the way of men dealing with these things. And I really enjoyed how Daniel spoke quite openly about going to therapy and things like that. Daniel's just a fucking dreamboat, I'm not gonna lie. Like, he's a great guy. Like, he's really grown up from like being a typical kind of lad's lad, and he really calls out other men on shitty behaviour. And there's a lot in here about him coming to terms with the fact all of his friends have like grown up and they've started their families and they're married. You know, they don't get to see each other and hang out all the time like they used to, and he's also the only like single one left. I actually found myself drawn to Daniel more than I was drawn to Nadia. I found him actually a more interesting character, which I think is definitely unusual when you're reading something that would come under the category of like contemporary women's fiction. You find yourself really, really rooting for these characters, and if you do like that kind of romance fiction with a really good hook, then I would highly recommend this one. I also read Memoirs of an Ex-Prom Queen by Alex Cates Shulman. This book was way more literary than I expected it to be. This is a book that looks at the restrictions placed upon young women in the 1950s. We follow our main character, Sasha, who is kind of the quintessential like American dream kind of girl. You know, she's beautiful, she's intelligent, she is the prom queen. But as she moves on from high school, she finds herself slightly directionless. A huge amount of this book is her stress around what value she's going to have once her looks start to fade. I think this book has really nuanced depictions of the traumas women's bodies go through. It looks at puberty and how men start to view her differently as she starts to go through it. It looks at both the power and the powerlessness her sexuality gives her. It looks at how she's been fed this dream, idyllic, middle-class American suburban life. Because she's been fed that so much, it's something that she desperately wants. But really, she is someone that has so much to give apart from that. She is so clever, and like she studies so many fascinating subjects, but she never really gets to do anything with the knowledge that she's developed because of the restrictions that society has placed on her. It's a very graphic book. There are a lot of extremely unhealthy relationships between men and women in this book, so be aware of that. It's all about sexual double standards and discrimination, and I found it a really fascinating read. It's super visceral, and I can see why it's such a cult classic. I think if you enjoy books like The Bell Jar, then you might enjoy this one as well. Next, I read another in the Penguin Mini Modern series. This is Daydreams and Drunkenness of a Young Lady by Clarice Lispector, and she is, I think, the first ever Brazilian writer that I've ever read anything from. In this very slim little volume, we have 3 of her short stories, which are all about women and their desires. But unfortunately, I don't think these stories were really for me. Lispector can describe really mundane things in quite a lyrical and emotive way, but ultimately they were mundane. I didn't think there was anything memorable about these stories. I didn't really connect with them. I didn't really get what point she was making with any of them. Also, there's a lot of weird stuff about blindness, and it comes across like very ableist. I think especially when I'd read so many other books this month that really intimately depicted experiences of womanhood, this one really felt flat, and I don't think it really achieved what it was trying to do, although I'm not even sure what it was trying to do. I mean, obviously if her writing has survived this long, there's definitely something of value in it that I am missing, but these short stories just really weren't for me. Moving on to the non-fiction, another one of those books that really intimately depicted experiences of womanhood. It was Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. I felt like I was the last person to read this book because I'd waited for the hype to die down a little bit, like I did with Girl, Woman, Other, and reading those two books quite near to each other was a really interesting reading experience. As I said, this is a non-fiction book that looks at 3 different women's experiences. Lisa Taddeo followed and corresponded with these women for 8 years and built up a really intimate portrayal of their lives. It really closely looks at their relationships with desire and sexuality. All 3 of these women want to be desired, and I think that's something that not only will resonate with women but resonates with men as well. Like, we all want to be wanted. These 3 women have had quite difficult experiences. Lena finds herself in a marriage with 2 children where her husband won't touch her. She's entirely unsatisfied. Sloane's story offers a really intricate look at the line between having a huge amount of sexual agency and just being a sexual object. A lot of her story focuses on how her husband enjoys watching her have sex with other people, both men and women. I think Maggie's story is the one that really resonates with women the most, at least women I've spoken to anyway, and her story really focuses on the relationship that she had with a teacher when she was underage, and her coming to realize that that was in fact a predatory relationship that she didn't actually have a lot of agency in. So many experiences in this book are really difficult and harrowing, and I do think you need to be in the right frame of mind to be able to read this book. I think it really strongly depicts the fears that women face on a day-to-day basis and why we have those fears, and I think it's a book that will really resonate with women, but I think it's a book that will also shock men and help them understand the women in their lives a lot better. Even with all of the harrowing experiences in this book, it is so beautifully written, and Lisa Taddeo manages to articulate things that like I felt but I've never really known how to put into words, and I think that's such an impressive thing for a writer to be able to do. And while this is non-fiction, it reads like fiction, which I think is really impressive and will draw a lot of people to reading this very necessary book. Basically what I'm trying to say is the hype is very well deserved. I also read A Manual for Heartache by Kathy Rensenbrink. This was quite an interesting read in that it's a very quiet book that basically just gives you tips and comfort in how to deal with periods of grief and loss. Very gentle book, and it feels like Kathy is just kind of holding your hand as you move through this book, and her telling you that it's okay to feel however you want to feel, and these are just some of the things that helped her, and hopefully they might help you too. Not preachy, it's not her telling you what you should and shouldn't do, it's her saying, do whatever works for you. This is what worked for me. I think this is potentially a book that I would have benefited more from in a different time of my life, a time when I was going through heartache. I'm actually doing pretty good right now, so I don't think this book resonated with me as much as it would have in a different point in my life, but I still think it's one that's really excellent, and it's such a quick read. I read this in one sitting, and it did feel like you're just being given a comfort blanket throughout your entire time reading it. So I have Testosterone Rex by Cordelia Fine. Fucking love this book. This is a non-fiction book all about like hormones and gender, and it really debunks a lot of myth around men and women's brains being different, at evolutionary science and psychology. It also looks at social history, at neuroscience, but like none of those things are presented in a complicated and confusing way. Like, she breaks down all of the science really well, and it's not intimidating. She really helps the reader understand some of the really like complicated subjects that she's looking at. Debunks a lot of scientific studies that actually aren't as sound as they would like to pretend they are. There are so many irrational arguments around gender politics, and I think she does a really great job of rallying against that. If you are interested in gender, if you're interested in like science writing, then I think this is a really fantastic book, and I would really recommend it. I cannot wait to read more of Cordelia Fine's books because I think I'm just obsessed with her. The final non-fiction book I have is The To-Do List and Other Debacles by Amy Jones. I kind of went into this book with the wrong idea because I thought it was literally a book about organization and to-do lists, and it's not. It is basically just like Amy's memoir but told through her to-do list. Like, they're used as a framework to tell her story, and it's a book about her struggling in her professional life and not really knowing what she wants about that. It's a book about her romantic relationships and her marriage. It's about growing up, falling in love, and a huge chunk of this book is about Amy dealing with her mental health problems, and I thought that was done in a really responsible way. This book, Amy begins to go to therapy, and it has a really honest depiction of what that's like and the benefits of it. I think this is a book that will resonate with a lot of people, particularly if you've gone through mental health issues like that, and I think it will be a real comfort to know that someone else has gone through stuff like that. But this wasn't really a book that I needed in my life at the time I read it. I didn't feel like much of it resonated with me anymore. And I think I did just go into it with the wrong expectations. I was looking for a book about organization, and then it was not this book. I'm going to pass this one on to a friend though that I think will really benefit from reading it. So I think it's definitely got like so much merit to it. It just wasn't for me. And the final book I'm going to talk about is the one poetry book that I read in January, and that is Search Party by Richard Mayer. This is a really well observed collection of poetry. It really looks at tiny moments and expands them into something intimate and honest. Some of the poems I enjoyed in here the most were there's a poem about a pass in a football match that is optimistic, but the poet really draws so much out of that very brief moment. There's a poem where he talks about not knowing if it was going to be the last time he and his children played hide and seek, and I thought that was just such a fascinating thought to explore and play with. Like, you will never know when the last time is going to be until much later on. I love concrete poetry as well, so poems that are in particular shapes, and these were two that I really enjoyed in this collection, particularly this one, which is about donating blood. I think all of these poems can be summed up as being about distance between people, about the connections between people, no matter how tenuous or brief, how those connections can still be so powerful. I really enjoyed this poetry collection. I'd never read anything from this poet before, and I thought it was really great. So that's it. They are all the books that I read in January. As I said, they will all be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more about them. And do leave me a comment down below if you've read any of these books and let me know what you thought of them. If you haven't read any of these books, let me know if you're now interested in reading them after I've spoken about them. And let me know what your favourite book that you read in January was. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.